Thank you for joining us today for the Halal certification regulation follow-up. My name is Max Stano. I'm a Global Connect Coordinator at WUSATA, which is the Western United States Agricultural Trade Association. Let me quickly cover 3 housekeeping notes for this. We're recording today's session and we'll email you the recording link from our YouTube page within the next few days. You'll remain muted during the presentation, but please submit questions anytime through the Q&A feature on Riverside. And finally, we'll address your questions during our dedicated Q&A session at the end. Any follow-up by email on anything we don't cover live is welcomed. And for today, I'm pleased to introduce Adam Halal from Bryant Christie Inc., who will be presenting on today's webinar. The webinar is for Western U.S. exporters, growers, packers, processors, and food marketers, targeting the Middle East markets who need a current understanding of halal certification. This is building on questions from previous WUSATA webinars and will cover certifying bodies, required documentation, and the compliance pitfalls that most often delay market access. So you will leave here with clear next steps ahead of upcoming trade activities. And let's get started.
Great stuff. Thanks, Max. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session on halal certification. It's a regulation follow-up, as was mentioned. Thanks for joining us, and thank you to WUSATA for making the seminar possible. So as Max mentioned, this seminar really is a follow-up to some of the halal certification questions that we've heard coming out of the prior WUSATA seminars. If you've been in one of our past sessions and have more questions on halal certification bodies, documentation, or compliance, today is really the session for you. By the end of this session, you should be able to walk away with a clearer picture of the current halal certification landscape and some concrete next steps for keeping your own certifications in good standing. My name, as was mentioned, is Adam Halal. I'm the Senior Trade Policy Specialist here at Bryant Christie. I work with primarily US exporters on the regulatory side of market access, really helping companies to understand what's required to get products into international markets and to stay compliant once they are there. Halal certification for Middle Eastern markets and for markets increasingly across parts of Asia as well is one of the areas that we get the most follow-up questions on. And that's exactly why we've put this session on today. I'm pleased to say that joining me is Mohammed Husseini from the American Halal Foundation. Mohammed brings with him a real wealth of on-the-ground expertise in halal certification and accreditation, and he's going to help get us specific today. So really diving into not just what the requirements are on paper, but how certification bodies actually operate and what auditors look for and where exporters most often run into trouble throughout that process. Between the two of us, we'll cover what's changed in the certification landscape. We'll walk through the documentation and application process, flag the most common compliance pitfalls, and help you think through how to select the right certification partner for your products and for your target markets. We'll leave some time at the end for any questions that you have, so please keep a running list as you go, and we'll address those at the end. And with that, let's get started. So on this slide, I've put together a quick list to kind of outline where we're heading today. We'll start with understanding halal. So really just spending a few minutes to make sure that we're all working from the same definitions before we do a deeper dive into the regulations. From there, we'll get into the halal certification landscape and what's changed since our last seminar on the topic, including updates to certification standards and how requirements across GCC countries can differ. Next is documentation and the application process. So really the practical side, what you need to submit, how long it takes, and how to coordinate with your suppliers and processors so you're not scrambling at the last minute for paperwork. We'll then look through common compliance pitfalls. So some of the mistakes we see most often, from labeling errors to picking the wrong certifier, and what happens if something slips through at the port of entry. From there, we'll look into selecting the right certification partner, where we'll talk about how accreditation actually affects market access and how to match a certifier to your specific products and destination markets. And then finally, Mohammed is going to walk us through a case study with the American Halal Foundation, looking at a real example that ties everything we've covered together and shows what this looks like in practice. And as mentioned, we'll close down with Q&A. So before we get into certification bodies and documentation and compliance and all that fun stuff, I wanted to spend a few minutes making sure that we're all starting from the same place on what halal actually means. Now, the following is not meant to be an exhaustive list. Think of it more of a quick reference or a shared vocabulary that we can point back to as we move through the rest of the session. If you've been exporting to Middle Eastern markets for some time, then you'll be familiar with all of this vocabulary and language. If you're newer to it, or it's been a while since you've had to think about the underlying religious concepts rather than just the paperwork, then this section is for you. It's more of a refresher. Either way, having these basic terms in hand now will make the certification and compliance discussion that follows a lot clearer, since a lot of the why behind specific requirements traces back to these definitions. Okay, so this is then really the practical starting point for everything else that we'll cover today, the terms that you'll really need to know. On the haram side, these are the clear no's. Pork and anything derived from pork, including gelatin, lard, or rennet, sourced from pigs, alcohol, whether it's the product itself or an alcohol-containing additive. Blood-derived products, meat from animals not slaughtered according to halal methods, and anything that's been cross-contaminated, whether that's the product itself or, importantly, the equipment that's touched non-halal materials. If your product or your supply chain has any one of these haram materials, then it's not a certification question, it's a reformulation or resourcing question. The middle column, or mashbur, is where most of our real work in this topic area actually happens. This is the it depends category, and this can include gelatins, glycerin, and the enzymes where the source needs to be verified. It can be flavorings or emulsifiers that could be plant, animal, or synthetic. Cultured dairy where the starter culture's origin matters, or capsules or processed foods with ingredient lists that you just don't have enough clarity on. None of these are automatically haram, but none of them are automatically halal either. And that's exactly why documentation and supplier verification, which we'll go into shortly, matter as much as they do. A mashbur ingredient becomes halal or haram based on what you can actually prove about its source, and that's really critical. Finally, then, there are those products that are halal, fruits, vegetables, grains, legumes, most seafood, dairy from halal sources, and meat and poultry that's slaughtered according to halal practices, and any of those mashbur ingredients once their source has actually been verified. The point and the main takeaway that we really want to leave you with here is that halal isn't really a fixed set of ingredients. It's really a verification standard. The same ingredient can sit in the mashbur column or in the halal column, depending entirely on what you can document about where it came from. That's really the lens that we'll be using for the rest of the session. So keep this framework in mind as we move into certification and documentation. So this slide really pulls those prior categories together into what actually gets audited and the core standards that apply across a halal certified operation. Starting then with food ingredients, which is the piece I think most people think of first, keeping products free from pork, alcohol, blood, and other haram substances. But the real work, as I mentioned, is in the additives, the gelatin, the enzymes, the emulsifiers, flavorings, since these can come from an animal, plant, or synthetic source, and that source has to be verified and documented. It can't be assumed. Processing and handling is where a lot of otherwise compliant products run into trouble. Even if every ingredient is halal, the production line itself has to prevent cross-contamination with haram items. This means dedicated equipment where that's possible, It means proper cleaning protocols where equipment is shared. And it means segregation carried all the way through storage and transportation, not just on the production floor. Packaging and labeling is another area that often gets overlooked. The packaging itself, think about animal-derived coatings on cartons, for example, has to be free of non-halal substances. And the label needs to clearly show halal certification from a certifying body that is actually accepted in the destination market you're shipping to. A great product with the wrong label or no visible certification marks can still and will likely get held up. And for anyone on this call working in the non-food sector, so cosmetics, pharmaceuticals, personal care, the same principles apply. These products need to avoid alcohol and any animal-derived ingredients like collagen, keratin, and lanolin, or all source those ingredients from only halal-approved suppliers. It's the same standard. It's just applied to a different shelf and a different sector. The thread across all four of these categories is the same as the one from the last slide. It's not just about what's in the product, it's about what you can prove at every stage from the ingredient to the shelf, which is really, really important. Okay, now that we've kind of level set with all the definitions, let's get into what's actually changed since our last conversation on this topic. Now, it has been changed, obviously, because halal certification is not a static thing. The standards, the accreditation bodies, the recognition rules between countries, they can all shift over time. And if you're working off what you learned even a year or two ago, there's a real chance that some of it is now out of date. That's the whole reason, really, that we've called this session as a follow-up rather than introduction, because there's so much change happening in this space. In the following section, we'll cover what's new in certification standards and accreditation requirements, and we'll get specific about how requirements differ from one GCC country to the next, because a certificate that clears customs in one Gulf market won't necessarily clear it in the next one. If you're only targeting one country right now, but think there's a good chance you might expand within the region, it's important to pay close attention to the information that we're about to cover. Okay, first I wanted to outline then who actually oversees halal certification in the markets most of you will be targeting. If we start then with the UAE, ESMA, or the Emirates Authority for Standardization and Metrology, oversees halal conformity assessment for anything heading into the UAE. The key detail here is that ESMA only accepts certificates from bodies on its own accredited registry. It doesn't matter how reputable your certifier is, if they're not on ESMA's list, that certificate doesn't do anything for you when your product reaches the UAE border. In Saudi Arabia, you're actually dealing with two authorities working together to regulate for halal products. The Saudi Food and Drug Authority, or SFDA, and the Saudi Standards, Metrology and Quality Organization, or SASO. Between the two of them, they set the halal requirements, and they require that your certifier be accredited under the Gulf Accreditation Center, or GAC. So again, accreditation is the gatekeeper. It's not just the certificate itself. Then there's the GCC wide layer, the GCC Standardization Organization, or GSO, which sets a common halal baseline that all member states must reference. Now, this is useful because it means there's a shared foundation across the region. But, the common mistake it's quite easy to make is thinking that one approach covers the whole Gulf, the whole GCC. It's really important to remember that individual countries routinely layer their own documentation or labeling requirements on top of this GCC baseline, which is exactly why we spent time earlier talking about the country-by-country differences. Finally, Oman, it accepts certificates from GAC accredited bodies, which puts it in line with that broader GCC accreditation framework, rather than running its own separate system. Now, it can get pretty complicated, but the pattern across all four of these markets is the same. It's really not sufficient to simply ask, is my product halal certified? The question that really matters is my certifier accredited by the specific authority in the specific country I'm shipping to? This is the distinction that really determines whether your paperwork will be accepted at the border. Okay, so this is the heart really of why we called today's session as a follow-up, and it's something that Mohammed will also touch on in more depth in his presentation. Here's what's changed in the regulatory space since the last time we talked about this topic. Now, the biggest structural change here is that GSO 2055-1 is being rewritten. So on February the 17th, earlier this year, the GCC Standardization Organization released a new draft of this standard, which essentially replaces the old 2015 version. This update isn't a minor update. It really brings stricter controls on prohibited substances. It introduces mandatory shipment level certification for high-risk animal products, and it adds new segregation and hygiene rules across the entire supply chain and not just at the production facility. So if you've been relying on a certification approach that's been built around the 2015 standard, this is the point at which that approach needs a second look. On the certifier side of things, there's good news for anyone in the room working with Mohammed's organization. Back in October of last year, the American Halal Foundation received accreditation from the UAE Emirates International Accreditation Center, EIAC, which is under the Ministry of Industry and Advanced Technology. This means that the certificates that the AHF certifies now gets full acceptance for UAE import approvals. So if you're already working with the AHF, that's one less certification question to worry about for that market specifically. Saudi Arabia has also been very active. The Saudi Halal Center recently launched a global halal mark alliance at the Makkah Halal Forum in February, and that was with Indonesia and Thailand signing on as founding partners. The stated goal is to reach 10 participating countries by the end of this year. And really the idea behind this is to reduce exactly the kind of certification fragmentation that we've talked about, where a certificate in one country that works in one market doesn't automatically work in the next. And more broadly, we're really seeing momentum towards mutual recognition across the region. So regulators and certifiers, bodies like JKIM, BPJPH, and ESMA are pushing much harder for agreements and shared traceability standards that let a single certification travel further instead of requiring a fresh approval in every market. Now, none of this means that the process is getting simpler, but it does mean that the direction is a bit clearer than it has been in the past. Less fragmentation, more shared recognition, and tighter standards underpinning all of this. So that kind of keep that context in mind as we move into the next slide, which will touch on documentation. Since a lot of what's required there traces directly back to these changes. Okay, so as I mentioned, all 6 GCC countries reference the same shared standards, GSO 2055-1 and -2. That's really useful. It means there's a common ground across the region. But as I mentioned, each country still runs its own national authority and has its own approval processes on top of that shared foundation. A certificate that clears customs in one member state still has to clear a separate approval process in the next one. The shared standard doesn't mean there's any shared customs clearance. Turning to specific markets, and we'll start with Saudi Arabia. So the Saudi FDA doesn't just check whether you're certified, it polices the actual logo on your packaging as well. You have to use an FDA approved halal mark. And here's the part that really kind of can catch people off. Even if your certifier is legitimately accredited, using the wrong logo or one that isn't FDA approved can still get your shipment rejected at the border. So it's a really important to pay close attention to the labeling aspects of all these requirements and not just the certification details. The UAE, it's a bit different, a bit more positive by comparison. Through the Emirates International Accreditation Center, the UAE accredits a wider range of international certification bodies than most of its neighbors. Practically speaking, that makes it a comparatively easier first market to enter if you're just getting started into the region. Qatar takes enforcement in a different direction. Qatar's Ministry of Public Health requires certificates specifically from Qatar-approved foreign certifiers, and it explicitly prohibits logos or symbols that aren't consistent with Islamic teachings. Again, this isn't just a paperwork issue. Violations can carry real financial penalties, up to 1 million Qatari riyals, so it's pretty significant. The main takeaway here is don't build one certification strategy and assume it covers the entire GCC. You need to build a strategy that really focuses on individual countries and then look for the overlaps and the commonalities between different markets. Okay, now that we've covered what's changed and how much variation exists across the GCC, we'll look at what it actually takes to get certified and how to keep that certification current. This section really dives a bit more deeply into the mechanics. We'll walk through the documentation a certification body will actually ask you for, what to expect with respect to timelines from initial application through to renewal, and how to coordinate all of this with your suppliers and processes, since a lot of what auditors ask for isn't something that you can produce on your own. It depends to a large extent on the information that your suppliers provide to you. If you've ever been caught off guard by an audit request or by how long an audit renewal takes, this is a section that should take that surprise away. So the first thing to note is that the paperwork starts early, well before you ever have to submit anything. You really need to get a full ingredient formulations with each of your suppliers against each of your products. A halal certificate or signed source declaration for every one of those ingredients, a process flow diagram, validated cleaning records, and really documentation that traces your packaging materials as well. This really is the kind of baseline material. And building it after you've already decided to apply is usually where people run into issues. On timelines, GCC certificates typically run for about 3 years, which is longer than you'll see in a lot of other regions. But getting to that first certification typically takes 4 to 8 weeks for manufacturers, and importantly, any change along the way, a new supplier, a new ingredient, a change in facility, all of those changes can reset that clock. So that 3-year validity period is really about staying certified once you're in. It's not about how quickly you'll get there. Now, as I mentioned, your suppliers are effectively part of your application file. Every ingredient supplier needs to have their own halal certificate or a signed declaration on hand, which means coordinating with each of them before you submit your application, not when an auditor comes back and asks for something that you don't have. And one more thing just to kind of keep in mind on your radar, shipments themselves are about to need their own certificates. Under the GCC's incoming standard, high-risk animal-based shipments will require shipment-level halal certification in addition to your facility certification. So that's a high level of granularity that you'll need to comply with. Okay, this slide is where we get into the part that most people get wrong, assuming certification is a one-time event. Certification is definitely not a one-and-done affair. Even though a GCC certificate typically runs for 3 years, that doesn't mean you can file it and walk away. You still need to go through annual surveillance audits during that period to keep the certification valid. The 3-year window is the validity period of the certificate. It's not a 3-year break from doing any oversight. Secondly, and this one has real financial consequences, expired means rejected. no exceptions. So if a shipment arrives at customs with a lapsed halal certificate, it gets rejected. And it doesn't really matter where or when the product was actually manufactured. Customs is looking at the certificate status on arrival, not the production date. Now, and that distinction has caught more than one exporter off guard over the years. Which is exactly why this third point matters as well. Renew early, not at the deadline. The best practice is to require your suppliers to send updated certificates at least 3 months before expiration. The renewal process can take a good amount of time, so waiting until the certificate is about to expire really leaves you no time for delay. And lastly, any change can trigger a new audit. So if you switch suppliers or you change an ingredient or make a facility change mid-cycle, what would otherwise be a routine audit can turn into a much more in-depth verification and inspection. That means extending your timeline when you think you might be planning a change in your ingredients or your processing, and really keeping in close coordination with your supplier and facility decisions. So any changes are not done close to your renewal date. The common thread across all four of these points is that renewal is not a formality. It's really an important ongoing responsibility, and the exporters who plan around that timeline avoid the exporters who get caught off by it and avoid issues shipping products to international markets. Now, importantly, your certification is only as strong as the weakest link in your supply chain, and that chain extends well past your own facility. If we start then with the core idea, the weak link invalidates the whole batch. A single uncertified ingredient or a processing line that's been compromised can invalidate an entire product run. That means verification has to reach every supplier and every processor in the chain, not just the final production step. It's tempting to think of certification as something that happens at your facility, but auditors are going to trace it all the way back. From my experience, shared equipment is probably one of the most common places that this breaks down in practice. If a co-manufacturer is running halal and non-halal on the same equipment, they need to either use a full physical segregation between those lines or document ritual cleansing and really clean the equipment between runs with staff who are specifically trained on halal protocols and can obviously back all of that up with documentation. This is not something you can assume a co-manufacturer already has in place. It's really important to ask them directly about this before you sign on and sign contracts. And that leads into the next point, building notification into your contracts. Your supplier agreements should require immediate notice of any change in ingredients, processes, certification status, and they should give you the right to unannounced audits. You don't want to find out about a change secondhand, or find out during your own audit that one of your suppliers has adjusted their processes. And finally, don't rely on a single certified supplier for anything critical. If you've only got one certified source for a key ingredient, that supplier's lapse becomes your problem instantly. Maintaining more than one certified source gives you a buffer in case something goes wrong on their end. Okay, so we've covered what's changed in the certification landscape and how requirements differ across the GCC. We've also covered what the documentation and renewal process requires. We're now going to turn to where exporters most often encounter difficulties in practice. The pitfalls that we'll look at are not unusual or obscure. These are recurring, well-documented issues that are entirely avoidable with the right awareness, yet they continue to delay shipments and jeopardize certifications for exporters who are otherwise well prepared. We'll cover 3 areas specifically. The first, frequent errors in documentation and labeling, common missteps in selecting a certification body, and the consequences that follow when non-compliance is discovered at the port of entry. Really consider this section a practical checklist rather than a cautionary tale. Kind of getting ahead and being aware of these patterns in advance is the most effective way to avoid the costs and delays associated with these type of mistakes. We'll begin with a look at documentation and labeling. So this slide outlines what a complete certification application actually requires, item by item. The formulation file comes first, as I mentioned previously. Every product needs a full formulation record that names the supplier responsible for each ingredient, supported by that supplier's halal certificate or by a signed source declaration. This is really the foundation of the application, and it can't be assembled after the fact. It depends entirely on documentation your suppliers must be able to provide in advance. Shared equipment, as I mentioned, requires its own paper trail, a process flow diagram identifying every point of contact with shared equipment, along with validating cleaning records that demonstrate that contaminants are effectively removed, completes the production side of the file. Auditors treat this as evidence, not assumption, so the validation itself must be documented, not simply asserted. Packaging is often overlooked, but it counts even when it doesn't appear on the label. Films, coatings, inks, release agents, and other processing aids that come into contact with the product also require documentation as well, regardless of whether they are listed as ingredients or not. And finally, the file does not stop at formulation. Auditors also expect batch records, finished product labels, that match the certified scope exactly, and a traceable chain of evidence confirming halal slaughter for any animal-derived inputs. Taken together, these four elements represent the complete documentation a certification body will want to see, not a partial submission that can be supplemented later on. Okay, this slide really addresses one of the most consequential decisions in the entire certification process, and that is which certifier to engage in the first place. Now, the first misstep here is treating speed and cost as proxies for reliability. A certifier that is quick and affordable at the outset is not necessarily accredited by the destination's market authority, and a rejected certificate at the border ultimately costs much more than working with a slower, properly verified certifier. Selecting a certifier should not be evaluated against recognition. Should be evaluated against recognition. It shouldn't be evaluated against convenience. The second point is that exporters should verify the certifier and not just a certificate. Fraudulent halal certificates circulate under the names of legitimate organizations. So it's not sufficient to simply trust a certificate at face value. Exporters should confirm a certifier's status directly against an official membership or an accreditation list before relying on it. Third, one certifier's standard is not automatically recognized everywhere else. A certifier's halal standard needs to be recognized broadly across the target markets that the supplier intends to serve, but not merely accepted in its home country. Without that broader recognition, a product can clear one border and then it can stall at the next. And finally, growth exposes a certifier's limits. A certifier that manages an initial application competently but may struggle to keep pace as the business scales is not helpful. This can leave exporters stuck mid-growth at the point where reliable certification matters most. Taken together, these 4 points make the same case. Certifier selection should not be treated as a due diligence exercise. It's not a procurement decision. Certification selection should be treated as a due diligence exercise. It's not a procurement decision that's based on price and speed alone. Okay, then this slide addresses what happens when non-compliance is not caught until the shipment has already reached the border, which is the most costly point for an issue to surface. Obviously, the first consequence is immediate. A reverse notification freezes the shipment. Missing or incompatible health certificates, absent halal slaughter certification, broken security seals, or evidence of fraudulent certification will all trigger automatic detention under official control until the issue is resolved. At that point, the shipment's no longer moving on the exporter's timeline. Detention does not mean automatically the shipment is lost. Importers can request additional manufacturer documentation or retesting at an approved laboratory, or reconfiguration to meet standards. They can also re-export or request supervised destruction. Each of these options is available, but each one adds time and cost, and none of them restore the original shipping schedule. The consequences also extend beyond the individual shipment as well. One violation follows the shipment history. GCC authorities track non-compliance by product, supplier, and country of origin, which means that food with a record of repeated violations is automatically detained on future shipments, regardless of whether that specific shipment's paperwork is in order. And that leads me to the final point, which is that poor compliance records results in closer scrutiny. Once a supplier is flagged for repeated violations, every subsequent shipment faces higher inspection rates, more frequent detentions, and extended laboratory analysis, not only the shipment that originally failed. So the main kind of takeaway here is that port of entry consequences are rarely isolated. A single compliance failure can shape how every future shipment from that supplier is treated. Okay, having reviewed the most common pitfalls, we'll now turn to probably the most constructive slide of this whole discussion: how to select a certification partner correctly from the outset. This section addresses three main areas. First, how accreditation specifically determines market access, since accreditation and certification are not interchangeable components. Second, how to match a certifying body to both your product category and to your destination market, given that the right certifier for one product line or one country is not necessarily the right certifier for another. And third, a practical set of questions to ask before engaging any certification body, so that your decision is based on verified information rather than an assumption. The objective of this section really is pretty straightforward. By the end of it, you should have a clear framework for evaluating a certification partner, rather than simply selecting the first available option. We'll begin by looking at accreditation and market access. So certification confirms, obviously, that a product meets Halal standards. Accreditation is a separate matter entirely. It's the approval of the certifier itself by a government or regional authority. The critical point here is that it's the accreditation, not the certification alone, that determines whether a given border will accept the product. This plays out differently in every market, because each market has its own set of rules and its own gatekeeper. Morocco, for example, requires specific recognition. Indonesia requires BPJPH accreditation. Saudi Arabia requires SFDA accredited certifiers. A product can be fully halal certified and still be turned away if the certifier that issued the certificate lacks the relevant accreditation in that specific market. There is, however, a mechanism that can simplify this, and that's mutual recognition, which can open multiple doors at once. A mutual recognition agreement allows one authority to accept certificates issued under another authority's accreditation. So in practice, that means that a single accredited certifier can sometimes provide access to several markets without each one requiring separate recertification. Now, finally, it's worth emphasizing that recognition is not permanent. Even accredited certifiers remain subject to ongoing audits and compliance monitoring, and accrediting bodies can and do revisit and withdraw recognition over time. So the practical implication of this is pretty straightforward. Accreditation should be confirmed for each specific destination market, and that confirmation should be revisited periodically, rather than simply assuming that the accreditation is valid indefinitely. So this slide addresses a distinction that many exporters assume does not exist. A certifier's qualification is not uniform across product categories. The first point illustrates this directly. Meat and poultry have their own rulebook. The GCC standard separates general halal food requirements covered under the GSO standard from a certification body requirements tied specifically to slaughter covered in a separate standard. A certifier qualified to certify packaged food is not automatically qualified to oversee meat and poultry. These are distinct areas of competence under the same overarching framework. The same logic extends to other categories. Supplements and cosmetics ask different questions of certifiers. Sorry, excuse me. Pharmaceuticals and supplements require scrutiny of growth and apologies. And inactive ingredients across every stage of development. While cosmetic, sorry about this, my voice is going a bit. The main point here is really that the right certifier depends on the specific product category and not the broader industry. And that becomes particularly important when working with certifiers that operate across multiple categories. One certifier may cover food, cosmetics, pharmaceuticals. That certifier can hold different recognition status for each category in a destination market. And finally, before my voice goes completely, I wanted to close out this section with a practical set of questions exporters should be prepared to ask before entering into an agreement with a certification body. The first question concerns oversight. Ask who is actually doing the auditing. Exporters should confirm how the certifier audits clients and what that inspection process actually covers, from ingredients to sanitation, before they sign on. This information should be volunteered readily by a reputable certifier. The second question addresses organizational structures. Independent or government-run changes what you get. An independent certifier can offer more tailored service for a specific industry, while a government-affiliated body may carry more weight with certain destination authorities. Neither structure is inherently superior. The right fit really depends on where the products are being shipped. Thirdly, exporters should ask what happens after the certificate is issued. A certificate's role does not end at the point of certification. A reliable certifier should be able to explain how it trains and supports the exporter's team on an ongoing basis, not only how it conducts its initial evaluation. And finally, then, exporters should ask what standard guides the certifier's own staff. It's worth confirming which Halal standards the certifier's auditors are trained against and how that training is documented, since a certifier's overall rigor ultimately traces back to how well it performs its own reviews and how well its own personnel understand the standards that they're enforcing. Taken together, these questions really give an exporter a structured basis for evaluating a certification partner rather than relying on a reputation or on a price alone. And with that, I want to hand the discussion over to Mohammed Husseini from the American Halal Foundation. Everything that we've covered so far, so the regulatory landscape, documentation requirements, pitfalls, and how to select the right certification partner, has been from our perspective as trade policy advisors. Mohammed's going to bring his perspective as a certifier, drawing on the AHF's certifying well over 1,000 companies. And he'll walk you through the market access frameworks they use and some of the most common myths they run into and what your own next step should look like if you're pursuing certification. As I mentioned, Mohammed brings direct experience on the certifier side of things. So I really encourage you to think about how you can best approach his advice, and think about this as an opportunity to hear how these requirements are actually assessed and applied, not just how they're written. And with that, I will hand things over to Mohammed. Over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Adam. And thank you all for the thank you all as far as the attendees and WUSATA for putting this together. I will go ahead and share my screen, and we can go ahead and discuss a few things. I must say that, Adam, your presentation was both excellent and comprehensive. And so if you ever consider a second career, I might know I might
I'll have to
we
make
might
sure my voice holds up before that does. That's
have.
it.
Well, and also in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over some slides because those were covered by Adam, and I'll try to get to the crux of what I think are 3 or 4 things that are most pertinent to folks that are looking to export. And then I also want to leave some time for questions. So without further ado, we'll get started. Like Adam mentioned, AHF is a leading global internationally accredited halal certification agency. And the key theme that we have is around 2 things. One is really streamlining the process to make it as efficient and effective as possible. And the second being, you know, doing exactly kind of what Adam alluded to, which is enabling companies with one certificate to access all the global markets. And for nearly every category and nearly every market, I'm very proud to be able to share that with one AHF certificate, you'll be able to essentially access the global markets. Now, each market has nuance. Each market has, idiosyncrasies, perhaps, but more or less that has been a very focal theme for our organization, is to allow companies essentially a certification that's as good as the U.S. passport, right? You can pretty much go everywhere, and we have been able to do so. In a nutshell, one of the things that sometimes people do get confused about halal is it seems like a lot of requirements. One simple heuristic in that vein of keeping things simple and easy to remember is that everything is halal except for ANA, so alcohol and intoxicants, and non-halal animal derivatives. I won't talk too much about it because Adam covered this very well. But if you want a useful heuristic, just remember this. One thing about global halal that I think maybe some folks might miss is, you get the markets, you get that it's large, it's multi-trillion-dollar halal industry of which a great portion of it is imports and so on and so forth. But why is it relevant? For a halal consumer, halal is bar none, especially for an adherent halal consumer. For an adherent halal consumer, halal is bar none a requirement and the most fundamental requirement in purchasing that product. So they're, in economic terms, the most intransigent, right? Or they're the most inelastic in that regard. And so sometimes you can think of halal like a claim, like organic, it's a nice to have. But actually, for an adherent halal consumer, it's a lot more like gluten-free for somebody with celiac, right? And that's something to keep in mind as you kind of assess the global markets. When 1 in every 4 halal consumers, 1 in every 4 consumers is a halal consumer. Specifically for the GCC, they're importing about 50 to 80% of their products. And what's interesting is that halal has been in the GCC region, let's say, for well over 1,000 years, but only now has it started to become institutionalized. And interestingly, you could say that here in the U.S., like my grandfather was one of the first people to do a halal audit ever in this country out of the Midwest. And, you could say that the U.S. was more mature in halal in some ways than even some of the GCC countries, but recently they have become much more mature and institutionalized around this. And we see the trend becoming more and more requirements around that. And our job is to sort of really enable that market access. And like Adam mentioned, there is the GCC-wide, GSO 2055-1 2026 update. And also, though not GCC related, Indonesia's mandatory certification for all imports, the deadline is October of this year, which definitely keeps us busy. So I want to address kind of one of the fundamental dilemmas that I think exporters or companies here in the States, kind of face. It's like, well, nobody woke up and said, I want to do an audit for fun, right? You often do it because you have to. And when it comes to halal, sometimes that need, so to speak, is not knocking on your door. And so it's this classic sort of chicken and egg. Do I get the certification and hope we get the customers, or do I wait till I get the customers and then get the certification? But the truth is, the dilemma is as such. Without the certification, you can't really get those customers at times, or can make it harder, depending on circumstance, for maybe 3 fundamental reasons. And then I'll also tell you the solution to the dilemma. But importers in competitive sectors are going to screen for halal in, their RFPs and RFIs and RFQs well before, the buyer conversation starts, right? In some sectors, you're going to have importers that are working on a seasonal deadline. So a supplier certified today is worth a lot more than a supplier that'll be certified in a couple months. And then, importers kind of can just ask for a certification, which would leave you scrambling at a certain point. So you could be, exporting into that market, and then, things are dandy until they're not, right? And so one of the things that we have done at AHF to really solve this dilemma is really separate facility and product certification. Like Adam alluded to, 80% of the challenge in certification is around raw materials and data and suppliers and, chasing down QA folks all around the country, all around the world for documentation, right? And that's the everlasting kind of challenge in QA and reg broadly. So what we have done at AHF is kind of separate these components out to where you have a halal production facility registration that sort of functions. You can kind of think of it like a GMP registration that says, hey, this facility is compliant to 21 CFR, whatever the part is, or, even a GFSI benchmark scheme like SQF and says, okay, the facility is approved. Well, what you can do with that is then you can go to the market and try to shop the certificate, so to speak, to get your customers to attract to your facility, and then you can add the products later. So this form of modularization has been immensely useful to AHF clients because, first of all, the cost and the process and the time and the just overall certification burden is immensely reduced when you're not dealing with products. But then when you do need products, to something Adam mentioned earlier as well, is like we have put a lot of energy to really focus on enabling streamlined addendums and product additions, because the whole idea is to do halal to grow your business. And we need to ensure that when you do grow, we're able to facilitate that. So in the interest of time, I won't go into more details of how those, all the configurations of that, but just know that by modularization of this has sort of solved the dilemma. So for a very marginal cost, you can sort of set up your facility as a certified facility, and then you can use that to get your customers and add the products later. And kind of like Adam alluded, you kind of want to start with how do you approach the global markets? You want to understand what market you are, what your products are, and ensuring your CB is recognized. At least at the AHF level, like I said, practically for every category and nearly every market, your one AHF certificate will function as a certificate for the entire world. But then the second part is like, what do you do at your facility level? Again, when you separate it out, there's two parts, there's two pillars. There's the facility compliance and there's the product level compliance, right? And the facility compliance is really, can you produce these products in an integrity protected way? So for folks that are familiar with maybe some of the GFSI or NSF standards, you have this idea of identity preservation, and it's fundamentally similar. If you want to think of it as another useful heuristic, non-halal products are like allergens, right? So if you have a good allergen control program, halal is not a huge lift. And that's our whole approach, is kind of like integrating halal within your existing QMS. To make it much easier. So let's get to some common myths and facts. One is that vegan is halal. That is not true for perhaps several reasons, but not least of which is that vegan does not prohibit alcohol. When you do get certified, not everything needs to be halal. Again, you could get your certification for your facility with technically 0 products. The other misconception that folks have is that everything needs to be dedicated. That also is not necessarily accurate, and all products containing ethanol are disqualified. There are carve-outs as far as ethanol. You can go up to 5,000 ppm, so 0.5% in the finished product, generally speaking, and there are some carve-outs for external applications. Another common sort of myth is, the time is very time intensive. It really isn't. Often, especially if you can leverage your existing QMS information, or that the cost is prohibitive. It's really not. I mean, it's often a very insignificant factor in the grand scheme of things, and companies, whatever marginal cost that they're putting in to certification, 1 or 2 POs can, sort of 100x that perhaps. Um, and if I won't go through all of those in the interest of time, but if you guys want these slides, you can email info@halalfoundation.org and just mention WUSATA in there, and my team will get it to you. So what's the actual certification process? Of course, it would be scoping and setting up an agreement, and then there'd be auditing. So this is something important to understand. The way we do audits is a little bit different. We stage them into two stages. So there's a documentation audit, and then there's a facility audit. In the documentation audit, I don't know if you guys have experience with auditors showing up and asking you to open up SharePoint, and you might be wondering, well, I could have done that, back wherever you came from. The documentation audit is done remote, and it goes through all the documents and scans for any errors or any issues and surfaces those ahead of time before those become NCs, right? And that sort of makes your facility audit much, much more smoother. So then when the auditor comes in, it's more about doing documentation verification and risk assessment and a facility walkthrough. But a lot of any core issues have already gotten ahead of during the actual audit. And then the actual certifications are good for between 1 and 3 years, and the facility would get its own cert and the products would get their own. Something really quick, we're able to integrate halal with non-GMO, gluten-free, vegan, GMP, and IFS, which is one of the GFSI standards, into a single audit. And fundamentally, that enables companies to get more certifications within the single audit, because if you guys have experience with the same, 4 auditors asking you fundamentally for the same thing and interpreting in different ways, our concept was, what if we brought that in-house and allowed companies to achieve multiple certifications within a single audit, and it's been extremely well received. As far as next steps, I would recommend you really consider facility level compliance initially, and this is kind of really a solution to the dilemma, if you will. Review your existing or planned certification portfolio and look at where, what the roadmap for that might look like. And if you're already certified, just review the recognitions and ensure that your certificates are going to support you as you grow. And you can qualify your facility and products at no cost at the link listed here. And we have a certification checklist. So if you scan that, you'll be able to get that. And you can also book a call for export readiness by emailing info@halalfoundation.org and just mentioning WUSATA. And all WUSATA member attendees are eligible for a 15% discount on whatever certification services that they may enlist with AHF within the next 30 days. And that is pretty much it. So I did rush through it a little bit in the interest of time, but hopefully you found it informative, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Great stuff. Thank you, Mohammed. So we'll open the floor up for questions. We've obviously covered quite a bit in the course of these presentations, but if anyone has any questions from the audience, now's the time to ask them.
Looks like there's 2 questions. One from Mark Nelson. Malaysian customers asking for halal certification for 100% dried wild blueberries. Why? Production facility only does sun-dried fruits. There are no animal or alcohol products used in their processing.
Yeah. So, as far as Malaysia, the reason the customer is asking is probably one of 2 things. One is that they have a certification program and they're being audited. And then when they go through an audit, they're asked for supplier verification. Now, you may be going through a facility that only does sun-dried fruits, but they don't have any third-party verification for that. And so the certification is a proxy to ensure that, that there's 100% no contamination risks or no allergen risk from a halal standpoint. There are ways that seemingly innocuous products like sun-dried fruits can actually be non-halal, but it's not obvious, and that would be a separate discussion. But the net of it is more or less according to JAKIM requirements, and JAKIM is a very strong halal influence in the Malaysian market, and that's probably where that's coming from. So it's just very important customer in their program.
Thank you.
And certainly, Mohammed, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but if we look at other markets similar, like Indonesia, who are going through the process, as you mentioned, of establishing their own system, any sort of like processing factor can bring products that would appear to be halal into that kind of that mashboard environment, right, or potentially even haram. So it's probably because of the processing nature of that the fact that they're dried blueberries and considered a processed product that would probably bring them within scope.
Correct. Yeah. And you may be doing the 100% the simplest, most straightforward thing, but not all producers are. So they just want to make sure you're in the category that's good for their requirements.
Perfect. Second question's from Simon Ganelli. Uh, am I good to assume that it would be an easier process to certify a range of 150 items that are all permissible, grains, vegetable oil, sweeteners, etc.? We are already kosher certified. We do not carry any animal or alcohol product. Would you be able to share a cost and time estimate? He understands that it might be hard to share on such a limited information.
So to answer let me answer the question about kosher and how that interfaces with the permissible item. Yeah, the answer is, would it be easier? 100%. Succinctly, that's you're going to have a lot of the documentation around what you had to prove to the according to the kashrut standard and the the rabbi and so on. So you're going to have a lot of that documentation, and that'll help you a lot. As far as a cost and time estimate, we'd probably be a couple more details, and we can circle back after the call. Happy to connect on that. But time-wise, for something straightforward, depending on how manufacturing is set up, somewhere between 4 and 12 weeks under standard processing, and within 4 weeks under expedited processing.
Perfect. And that's all the questions I see in the chat for now. Perfect. Up and coming is the Best of the West. It's an inbound into San Francisco, Fresno, and Los Angeles. So if you're interested at all on the WUSATA side, please reach out to gx@wusata.org and we can help get you guys registered. We're going to have buyers from the Middle East coming in for that specifically. In addition to that, following today's webinar, you'll receive a brief survey in your My WUSATA account under the survey's title, Your Feedback is Crucial. It helps us improve and secure continued funding for these programs. We greatly appreciate you taking a moment to complete it. I think we have one more question. Before I get to the rest of the things, follow up from Simon. We're planning to attend the Natural World Expo Saudi in December 2026 and want to see if there are any opportunities to participate. Simon, we will look into that for you. Fund Match might be a good route for you to go down to receive funding. Feel free to reach out to us and we can look more into it. In addition, free consultation opportunity. Remember, you can schedule a complimentary 30-minute consultation with Brian Christie to discuss your specific export needs and questions. Also can schedule with Mohammed. Great shout out at the end right there. And thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it and sitting in and learning more about the certification process. Thank you, Mohammed, and thank you, Adam, for your great presentations today. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.